The clink of a dropped fork on the marble floor of Ethelgard was a gunshot in a library. Every head in the opulent dining room, a sea of old money and new ambition, turned in unison. Every head, that is, except for the man at table 7, Sterling Blackwood, who continued to smirk, believing he had just won. He had no idea that the young waitress he had been tormenting, the one he'd just dismissed as an incompetent child, possessed a palate so refined it was a registered instrument, capable of dismantling his entire empire with a single, whispered observation. As the restaurant's hushed reverence curdled into a palpable tension, his power play over a soiled tablecloth was about to become the catalyst for his own spectacular ruin. What was about to happen would not just shift the balance of power, it would shatter it so completely that by the time he understood the truth, the foundations of his world would already be turning to dust. The relentless August humidity of New York City clung to the city like a wet shroud, but inside Ethelgard, the air was different. It was chilled, filtered, and scented with the subtle, intoxicating perfume of wealth, a blend of aged leather, white truffle oil, and the ghost of century-old port. The dining room was a masterpiece of understated grandeur, with dark mahogany walls, chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen tears, and tables spaced so far apart that each one was its own private kingdom. For 20-year-old Maya Jimenez, it was both a prison and a university. Dressed in the restaurant's severe, starched uniform, a black dress so modest it was almost monastic, and flat, sensible shoes that still couldn't prevent the ache in her feet after a 10-hour shift. Maya looked like just another part of the scenery, but beneath the veneer of a struggling student earning her way through culinary school, a fire of fierce ambition burned. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a scholar in a field laboratory. Every night, she absorbed the lexicon of luxury. She memorized the intricate dance of the service, the subtle cues of the clientele, the way the head sommelier, Monsieur Dubois, could describe a wine with the lyrical passion of a poet. In a small, worn notebook she kept in her locker, she meticulously recorded her observations. The surprising success of pairing a briny Kumamoto oyster with a dry, almost saline Assyrtiko. The way the chef used a hint of smoked paprika to elevate a simple seared scallop. The faint note of disappointment in a patron's eyes when a Bordeaux was served a single degree too warm. Tonight, the air was even more charged than usual. Table 7, the best in the house, with its panoramic view of Central Park South, was occupied by Sterling Blackwood. Blackwood was a titan of New York real estate, a man who built gleaming, soulless towers of glass and steel by bulldozing history. He was in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair meticulously coiffed, a tan that spoke of wintering in St. Bart's, and a voice that was permanently set to a booming frequency designed to intimidate. He wore a Brioni suit that probably cost more than Maya's entire year's tuition, and on his wrist, a gargantuan gold watch served as a constant, glittering reminder of his own importance. He was dining with 2 Japanese investors, quiet, impeccably dressed men who watched him with polite, unreadable expressions. Blackwood was clearly trying to close a deal, and his method of seduction was brute force. From the moment he sat down, he had been a nightmare. He'd sent back the amuse-bouche, declaring it pedestrian. He'd complained that the chill on his vodka martini was imprecise. He treated the staff not as people, but as inconvenient obstacles to his own satisfaction, and his attention, for some reason, had zeroed in on Maya. "You," he barked, snapping his fingers as she approached to refill his water glass. He didn't use her name, though she had introduced herself at the start of the service. To him, she didn't have one. The bread. It's cold. Is the baker on vacation? I'll bring a fresh basket right away, sir, Maya said, her voice a practiced calm she did not feel. The bread was a specially baked sourdough, served at room temperature to preserve its delicate crumb structure. It wasn't meant to be hot. See that you do, and try to move with a little more purpose. This isn't a public library. As she turned away, she heard him mutter to his guests in a stage whisper. Affirmative action hire. They're everywhere now. Can't find good help. The comment landed like a physical blow, hot and shameful. She felt the eyes of the other diners on her, a mixture of pity and discomfort. She retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly, as she arranged a new selection of bread in a linen-lined basket. The chef, a fiery but fair man named Antoine, saw her expression. "Blackwood?" he asked, his French accent thick. Maya just nodded. "He is a pig," Antoine grunted, turning back to his station. "A rich pig, but even a pig can be slaughtered. Be careful, ma petite." Returning to the table, she placed the bread down. Blackwood ignored her, launching into a loud monologue about his latest acquisition, a historic brownstone in the West Village he planned to gut and turn into luxury condos. "History is for books," he boomed. "The future is for profit." Across the room, in a discreet corner booth, another man watched the scene unfold. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored tweed jacket that seemed out of place in the sea of dark suits. He was alone, and he had been nursing a single glass of scotch for over an hour. His name was Julian Croft, and to the uninitiated, he was just another quiet, wealthy patron. But to the world of gastronomy, he was a ghost, a kingmaker, a terror. Croft was the most influential and feared food critic on the planet. His anonymous reviews, published under the pseudonym Veritas, could elevate a humble bistro to a 3-star Michelin temple or bankrupt a celebrated institution overnight. He was also a silent majority partner in the international consortium the Japanese investors represented. He was here not to dine, but to observe. He was the final, unseen hurdle for Blackwood's deal, and so far he was profoundly unimpressed. Croft's initial assessment of Maya had been neutral, another young, efficient server. But he had noticed the way her eyes lingered on the wine labels as she passed the sommelier station, the flicker of concentration as she described a special to another table. He saw a diligence that went beyond the mechanics of the job. Now, watching her absorb Blackwood's boorishness with a stoic grace, a flicker of something else registered. Resilience. The evening wore on, a slow-motion train wreck of etiquette. Blackwood, attempting to impress his guests with his supposed worldliness, decided to take over the wine selection from the sommelier. He waved away the leather-bound wine list, a tome as thick as a Bible. "Dubois!" he bellowed, summoning the distinguished silver-haired sommelier. "I won't need your suggestions. I know what these gentlemen will appreciate. We'll have the 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild." A hush fell over the nearby tables. The 82 Lafite was not just a wine, it was a legend, a liquid monument. Ethelgard was rumored to have only 6 bottles left in its cellar, each one valued at over $20,000. It was a choice of such audacious extravagance that it bordered on vulgarity. Monsieur Dubois blinked, his professional poise momentarily shaken. "An excellent choice, Mr. Blackwood. A truly monumental wine." "Of course it is. I have the best taste. Bring it out. And don't take all night." Dubois retreated toward the cellar, his shoulders slightly slumped. Julian Croft watched, a small, cynical smile touching his lips. The 82 Lafite was a magnificent wine, but it was also the most obvious, the most cliché choice for a man of new money trying to prove his status. It was the wine equivalent of a gold-plated Lamborghini. A man of true taste would have chosen something more subtle, more interesting. This was the moment the fork fell. As Maya was clearing the appetizer plates, Blackwood gestured expansively with his hand, knocking his own salad fork off the table. It clattered onto the floor. "For God's sake," he sighed, rolling his eyes as if it were her fault. "Can you do anything right? Clean that up." Maya bent down, her cheeks burning. As she picked up the fork with a napkin, her eyes fell on Blackwood's shoes. They were gleaming, hand-stitched alligator loafers, and one of them was resting squarely on the corner of the pristine white tablecloth, leaving a dirty, greasy smudge. She stood up, the fork in her hand. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you've soiled the linen. Would you like us to reset the table for you?" Blackwood looked down at the smudge, then back at her. His eyes narrowed into cruel slits. He saw her not as a helpful waitress, but as an accuser, someone who had dared to point out his own sloppiness. "Are you suggesting I'm messy, girl?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You drop a fork, and now you're trying to blame me for a smudge? I think you're incompetent. In fact, I think you're a liability. I want a new server, and I want you to go back to the kitchen and stay there until you learn some manners." The manager, a perpetually nervous man named Philip, scurried over, his face pale. "Is there a problem, Mr. Blackwood?" "Your waitress is the problem," Blackwood snapped. "She's clumsy, she's insolent, and she's accusing me of dirtying the table. Get her away from me. I come here to spend $50,000 on dinner and wine, and I have to deal with this amateur. It's unacceptable." Philip turned to Maya, his eyes pleading with her to just disappear. "Maya, please, apologize to Mr. Blackwood and go to the back." Maya stood frozen. An apology was a lie. It was a surrender. But her job, her tuition, her entire precarious existence depended on this. She looked at Blackwood's smug face, at the smirking triumph in his eyes. She looked at the Japanese investors who were now studying the ceiling with intense interest. She looked at the other diners, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and embarrassment. And then her gaze drifted to the corner booth, where she met the cool, analytical eyes of Julian Croft. He gave no sign, no encouragement, no judgment. He was simply watching. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Maya made a choice. She would not apologize, but she would not fight. Not yet. She gave a slight, stiff nod. "As you wish, sir." She turned and walked away from the table, her back straight, her head held high. Blackwood chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He had won. He had put the help in her place. He leaned back in his chair, the undisputed king of his table, and waited for his legendary wines to arrive, completely unaware that he had just armed the one person in the room who could bring his kingdom crashing down. The atmosphere in the kitchen was as thick and hot as the soup simmering on the stove. Maya stood by the dish station, her hands clenched at her sides, replaying the scene in her mind. The humiliation was a physical ache, a knot of fire in her stomach. Philip, the manager, cornered her by the walk-in freezer. "What were you thinking, Maya?" he hissed, his face slick with sweat. "You don't talk back to a guest like Sterling Blackwood. You smile, you apologize, and you do whatever they want. Do you have any idea how much he spends here? His bill tonight will be more than you make in a year." "He was lying," Maya said, her voice tight. "He put his shoe on the tablecloth. I saw him. I don't care if he was dancing a tango on the table in golf spikes," Philip Whisper shouted, his jowls trembling. "Your job is to make him happy. You're on thin ice, Maya. One more complaint, and you're gone. Now stay back here and polish silverware until I tell you otherwise." He scurried away, leaving Maya in the clattering, chaotic heart of the restaurant. She felt a profound sense of injustice, but also a surge of cold fury. It wasn't just about the smudge or the insult. It was about the casual, unthinking cruelty of it all. The assumption that because she wore a uniform, she was less than human, an object without feelings or dignity. She picked up a piece of silverware, a heavy, ornate dessert spoon, and began to polish it with a clean cloth, her movements sharp and precise. As she worked, her mind shifted. She pushed the anger down, transmuting it into focus. She thought about her classes, about the lectures on oenology, the science of wine. She remembered a specific lesson on wine authentication, a dry but fascinating seminar on how to spot fakes. The professor, a wizened old Frenchman, had stressed the importance of details the average person would never notice: the specific color of the ink on the label, the texture of the paper, the subtle striations in the glass of the bottle itself, the exact depth and branding of the cork stamp. "The devil," he had said, tapping his temple, "is always in the details. Mes enfants." At that moment, Monsieur Dubois entered the kitchen, his face a mask of professional gravity. He was heading for the service station where the Lafite would be presented. He carried a silver tray with a decanter, a corkscrew, and a sommelier's tasse de vin. He looked preoccupied, his mind clearly on the ritual he was about to perform. A few minutes later, a junior sommelier, a young man named Jean-Paul, emerged from the cellar, carrying the bottle of 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild with the reverence of a priest carrying a holy relic. He held it in a wicker cradle, careful not to disturb the sediment. He placed it on the service station near the kitchen door. Dubois was momentarily called away to another table to handle a less dramatic, but still important, wine query. Jean-Paul, looking nervous at being left alone with such a treasure, fussed with the glassware. From her station, polishing silver, Maya had a clear view of the bottle, and as her eyes, trained by hours of study and an innate, obsessive attention to detail, fell upon it, a strange sense of unease crept over her. Something was wrong. She put down the spoon and wiped her hands on her apron. Casually, as if she were just passing through, she walked closer to the service station. Jean-Paul barely noticed her. Maya's gaze devoured the bottle. It wasn't one thing. It was a collection of tiny, almost imperceptible inconsistencies. The label. The paper had a slightly modern, uniform texture, lacking the subtle, almost organic mottling she'd seen on authenticated pre-1990s bottles. The ink of the famous Chateau illustration seemed a little too sharp, too perfect, as if printed with a modern laser printer rather than an old-world press. The capsule. The foil covering the cork was a shade too bright, the embossed seal lacking the minute, handcrafted imperfections of the era. And then she saw it, the detail that made the breath catch in her throat. The ullage, the small air gap between the cork and the wine, was too large for a bottle of its supposed age and perfect storage conditions, and through the dark green glass, the color of the wine itself seemed to have a slightly brownish, oxidized tint at the edge that was inconsistent with a perfectly preserved 82 Lafite, which should still be a deep, vibrant garnet. The devil is in the details. Her heart began to pound. It couldn't be. Ethelgard's cellar was legendary, its provenance unimpeachable. To suggest a bottle was a fake would be an accusation of catastrophic proportions. It would be professional suicide. Philip would fire her on the spot. Dubois would have her blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. But then she thought of Blackwood, his smug, triumphant face, his casual cruelty, his belief that his money could buy him the right to be a monster. And she thought about the wine. That bottle wasn't just a beverage, it was a piece of history, a work of art. To allow a fraud like Blackwood to toast his corrupt deal with a fraudulent wine felt like a perversion of everything she loved and respected about this world. Monsieur Dubois returned to the station, his attention now fully on the bottle. "Bon," he murmured to himself, picking up a special two-pronged cork puller used for delicate aged corks. "Let us present the king." Maya knew it was now or never. "Monsieur Dubois," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Maya?" "I am occupied." "The bottle, monsieur," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Forgive me, but I do not believe it is authentic." Dubois froze, the cork puller halfway to the bottle. He stared at her as if she had just sprouted a second head. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Excuse me. What did you just say?" "The label, the capsule, the ullage," Maya said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength as she recited her observations. "They are not correct for an 82. I believe it may be a counterfeit. A very good one, but a counterfeit nonetheless." The sommelier's smile vanished, replaced by a thunderous expression. "You are a waitress," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You serve the wine. You do not analyze it. You have been studying for what? A year? I have been drinking Lafite since before you were born. You are hysterical from your little incident with Mr. Blackwood. Go back to your silverware, now." "But monsieur, if you would just look." "Enough," Dubois snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He pointed a trembling finger toward the kitchen. "You are finished, do you hear me? Philip will have your final paycheck ready. Get out." The finality of his words hit her like a physical blow. Fired. Just like that. For trying to do the right thing, for daring to have an opinion. But as she stood there, stripped of her job, a strange calm washed over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She was right, and she would not be silenced. Just as Dubois turned back to the bottle, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "Let the girl speak." Both Maya and Dubois turned. Julian Croft was standing there. He had left his corner table and approached them so silently neither had noticed. His face was unreadable, his eyes like chips of grey ice. He wasn't looking at Dubois. He was looking at Maya. "She has made an extraordinary claim," Croft said, his voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "I, for one, am curious to hear her reasoning." Dubois' face went pale. He recognized Croft. Every major figure in the New York culinary scene knew who he was, or at least who he was rumored to be. The anonymous kingmaker. "Mr. Croft," Dubois stammered, his arrogance evaporating. "This is a staff matter, a misunderstanding. The girl is overwrought." "She doesn't look overwrought to me," Croft said, his gaze still fixed on Maya. "She looks observant. Tell me, young lady. Tell me exactly what you see." The entire service area had fallen silent. The usual kitchen clamor faded into a background hum. Every chef, every busboy, every server was watching. This was no longer about a disgruntled waitress. It was a showdown. Maya took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was her one chance. She couldn't afford a single mistake. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, pointing to the bottle without touching it. "The label stock is too modern. An authentic 82 would use a laid paper. You'd be able to feel the texture. This is a wove paper. Too smooth. The printing, as I told Monsieur Dubois, has the precision of a digital process, not offset lithography, which would show microscopic bleeding at the edges of the ink. Croft nodded slowly, listening intently. "The capsule," Meyer continued, gaining confidence. "The color is a standard PMS 201C red. The Lafitte capsules from that era had a proprietary, slightly more orange-tinted red that is notoriously difficult to replicate, and the embossing of the Rothschild crest, the detail is a fraction of a millimeter too shallow." Dubois was staring at the bottle now, his own expert eye re-examining it through the lens of Meyer's critique. A seed of doubt was clearly being planted in his mind. "And finally," Meyer said, her voice dropping, the glass itself. "Pre-1985 Bordeaux bottles, especially from the first growths, have a characteristic push-up or punt at the base, with a slight, almost invisible seam from the mold. This bottle's seam is too perfect, too symmetrical. It's the mark of a modern, mass-produced bottle." She finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had laid her entire, meager credibility on the line. There was a long, heavy silence. Julian Croft stepped forward and, with a delicate touch that belied his age, picked up the bottle. He didn't look at the label. He turned it over and ran a single, expert finger over the base. He held it up to the light, examining the ullage and the color of the liquid within. He set the bottle down gently. He looked at Monsieur Dubois, and his expression was one of profound disappointment. "For 20 years, I have considered your cellar to be a sanctuary, a place of integrity." Then he turned his gaze to Meyer. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold analysis appeared in his eyes. It was respect. "She is correct," Julian Croft stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "On all counts, this wine is a fake, a forgery, and a rather clumsy one at that." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Monsieur Dubois looked as if he might faint. Jean-Paul, the junior sommelier, backed away as if the bottle were radioactive. From table 7, Sterling Blackwood's voice boomed across the now silent dining room. "What is the hold-up? Are you growing the grapes back there? Bring me my wine." Julian Croft's eyes hardened. He picked up the fraudulent bottle. "I believe," he said, in a voice that was suddenly lethally cold, "it's time to serve the guest his wine." He turned and began walking toward table 7, the bottle held loosely in his hand. Meyer, feeling as if she were in a dream, found herself following a few paces behind him. The entire restaurant watched, a captive audience to a drama they didn't yet understand. Blackwood saw them approaching, his face a mask of impatience. "It's about time. Who is this old man? Another one of your managers?" He looked past Croft and saw Meyer. "I told you to get rid of her. What is she doing here?" Croft arrived at the table and placed the bottle squarely in the center, next to the bread basket. His movements were deliberate, precise. He looked at Blackwood, then at the 2 Japanese investors, Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Ito. He gave them a slight, formal bow, which they returned. "Mr. Blackwood," Croft began, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "My name is Julian Croft. I am a senior partner with the Tokyo Acquisitions Group." The effect of his words was instantaneous. Blackwood's jaw went slack. The color drained from his face. He had been performing for his mark all night, completely unaware that his mark was sitting 20 feet away, watching his every move. The investors, Tanaka and Ito, straightened in their chairs, their polite neutrality replaced by sharp, focused attention. This, clearly, was the man whose opinion truly mattered. "Mr. Croft," Blackwood stammered, trying to recover. I had no idea you were here. A pleasure. A wonderful surprise." "I'm sure," Croft said dryly. "You ordered this wine, the 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. A bold choice, a statement. Only the best," Blackwood said, puffing his chest out, attempting to reclaim some of his lost bravado. A toast to our new venture. Indeed, Croft said. There's just one small problem. He tapped the bottle with his index finger. It's a fake. Blackwood stared at him, then burst into a laugh, a harsh, grating sound. A fake? Don't be ridiculous. This is Ethelgard. Their cellar is flawless. You're mistaken. He shot a venomous glare at Maya. This is her doing, isn't it? This fired little waitress is filling your head with nonsense to save her job. She was not fired, Croft corrected him coldly. She was, in fact, the only person in this entire establishment with the expertise and the integrity to identify this fraud. She has just saved this restaurant from catastrophic embarrassment, and you, Mr. Blackwood, from toasting your deal with a bottle of glorified grape juice. He turned to the investors. Tanaka-san, Ito-san, he said, switching to fluent Japanese. The man we are considering for this partnership has the palate of a fool and the manners of a boor. He has spent the entire evening demonstrating a profound lack of respect, not only for the staff, but for the very concept of quality he claims to embody. The investors listened, their faces impassive, but a flicker of understanding passed between them. Blackwood, not understanding the words, but sensing the shift in the room, began to panic. What? What? The silence that followed the investor's departure was a physical entity, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the opulent dining room. It was a silence made of 100 other sounds, the nervous scrape of a chair leg, the ghost of a cough from a distant table, the almost imperceptibly loud thumping of Maya's own heart against her ribs. The air, once chilled and scented with truffle oil and triumph, now tasted of ozone and ruin. Sterling Blackwood remained at table 7, a statue carved from ash, his face a canvas of disbelief, slowly curdling into the primal horror of a king watching his own beheading. The Brioni suit, which moments ago had been a suit of armor, now looked like a costume on a broken mannequin. His world had not just turned to dust, it had been unmade, deconstructed atom by a quiet old man and a 20-year-old waitress. Julian Croft didn't gloat. He was a force of nature, and a hurricane does not pause to admire its wreckage. He moved with a quiet, surgical precision. A single, sharp glance was enough to send the disgraced Monsieur Dubois scurrying towards the cellar, his face a mask of abject terror and shame, already beginning the penance of his inventory. Another look dismissed the gawking staff back to their duties, though they now moved with the furtive, wide-eyed energy of people who had just witnessed a miracle or an execution. Croft's gaze finally settled on Blackwood. "The check," he said, his voice a calm, conversational blade, "will be for the martini and the appetizers. The educational experience is complimentary." Blackwood's head snapped up. For a moment, a flicker of his old, brutish arrogance returned, a cornered animal preparing for a final, futile lunge. His eyes, venomous and red-rimmed, bypassed Croft and locked onto Maya. The hatred in them was a tangible thing, a heat she could feel on her skin. "You," he rasped, the word a shard of glass. "This was you, a little nobody with a grudge." Maya met his gaze. The fear that had been her constant companion for years, fear of rent, of tuition, of failure, of men like him, was gone. In its place was a strange, cold clarity, a stillness at the eye of the storm. She saw him not as a titan, but as a hollow man, a collection of appetites and insecurities wrapped in expensive fabric. "No, Mr. Blackwood," she said, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. It was the voice of the person she was becoming. "It was the wine. It wasn't real. You surrounded yourself with things that weren't real, and one day they simply fell apart. She had meant the counterfeit Lafitte, but as the words left her mouth, she realized their truth ran far deeper. His power, his reputation, his very identity. It was all a forgery. With that, she turned her back on him. It was the most profound dismissal of his life, more cutting than Croft's verdict, more final than the investor's departure. He was no longer a factor. He was history. Croft gestured for her to follow him into the controlled chaos of the kitchen. The moment they passed through the swinging doors, the atmosphere shifted. Chef Antoine, who had watched the entire spectacle from the pass, gave her a single, solemn nod of profound respect. The line cooks, the dishwashers, the other servers, they all looked at her differently. She had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just one of them. The realization brought not pride, but a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. Croft led her to a small, cramped office behind the dry storage, a space that smelled of old paper and yeast. He closed the door, shutting out the world. He did not sit, but leaned against a filing cabinet, studying her with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "Tell me something, Miss Jimenez," he began, his tone shifting from judge to inquisitor. "Why did you do it? When Dubois threatened to fire you, when every instinct for self-preservation must have been screaming at you to be silent? Why did you push?" Maya had to think. The answer wasn't simple. At first, it was anger. He was cruel. He humiliated me for no reason. She looked at her hands, still remembering the feel of the cheap, sensible shoes on the plush carpet. But when I saw the bottle, it became something else. It wasn't about him anymore. That wine, even a fake version of it, represents something. It represents history and patience and craftsmanship. It's the life's work of dozens of people, from the farmer who tends the vines to the cooper who makes the barrel. To let a man like him use a counterfeit of that to celebrate a corrupt deal, it felt like a desecration. It was a lie, and I worked too hard to be a part of a lie. Croft was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. "When I was a young man," he said eventually, his voice softer, more reflective, "I was the lead critic for the London Spectator. A new chef had opened a restaurant in Mayfair. All flash, no substance. I knew it. My palate knew it. But he was the darling of the social set, and I was ambitious. I wanted a seat at their table, so I wrote a glowing review. I praised his technique, his daring. I lied. The restaurant was awarded 2 Michelin stars based largely on my column. It collapsed under the weight of those expectations less than a year later, taking a dozen young chefs' careers with it. I built my own reputation on a foundation of sand." He looked directly at Maya. "I never made that mistake again. I learned that integrity is the only thing a man in my position truly owns. It is not a virtue. It is a currency. And you, Miss Jimenez, appear to be extraordinarily wealthy." The confession hung in the air between them, a stunningly intimate revelation that recontextualized everything. He wasn't just a mentor. He was a penitent. He saw in her the integrity he had once sacrificed. "That is why I am going to make you an offer," he continued, his voice regaining its briskness. "It is not a reward for what you did tonight. A reward is something you get for being lucky. This is a consequence. You have demonstrated a rare and dangerous talent, and such things must be cultivated, lest they wither or become malignant." He then laid out the proposal, the scholarship, the apprenticeship in Paris with the legendary tyrant, Luc Bouchard. He painted a brutal picture of the years to come. It would not be an education. It would be an ordeal. He described Luke not as a teacher, but as a whetstone, a cruel, abrasive surface against which she would either sharpen herself to a razor's edge or be ground down to nothing. Luke believes wine is a religion, and he is its angry god, Croft said, without a trace of hyperbole. He will mock your accent. He will belittle your knowledge. He will give you impossible tasks and delight in your failure. He will not teach you a single thing. He will merely provide the hostile environment in which you will be forced to teach yourself. Most people break. If you survive, you will not just be a sommelier. You will be a master. The choice is yours. Tears threatened, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. This was not a moment for gratitude, but for resolve. She thought of her life up to this point, a series of compromises and quiet surrenders, of smiling through insults and swallowing her pride. That life had ended tonight on the floor of Ethelgard. This was the first day of a new one. "When do I start?" she asked. A rare, genuine smile touched Julian Croft's lips. "Excellent. My office, 9 a.m. We will handle the logistics. For now, go home. Your employment at Ethelgard is, of course, terminated. You are far too qualified to be a waitress here." The 2 years that followed were a blur of sensation, a montage etched in scent and taste and exhaustion. Paris was not the city of lights. It was the city of cellars, of cold, damp stone and the holy scent of earth and aging grapes. Luc Bouchard was worse than Croft had described. He was a small, gnarled man with a perpetually disappointed expression and a tongue that could strip paint. He never used her name, referring to her only as l'Américaine. He started her not with wine, but with water, forcing her to spend a month blind tasting dozens of mineral waters from across Europe until she could identify the source of each by its specific salinity and mineral profile. Then came soil. She spent weeks with her hands plunged in bowls of dirt, clay from Pomerol, limestone from Sancerre, slate from the Mosel, learning to identify a vineyard by the smell of its earth on a rainy day. Her first 6 months were a litany of failures. She confused a Premier Cru Chablis with a Pouilly Fouissé and was banned from tasting white Burgundy for a month. She served a Côte Rôtie, a single degree too warm, and was forced to polish every glass in the 3,000-bottle cellar by hand. She cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count, the taste of humiliation more potent than any wine. But she didn't break. With every insult, her resolve hardened. With every failure, her focus sharpened. She stopped trying to please him and started trying to best him. She read until her eyes burned. She tasted everything, from the humblest vin de pays to the most hallowed Grand Crus, cataloguing each nuance in a mental library that grew vaster by the day. She learned that a wine's story wasn't just in its flavor, but in its flaws, its texture, its silence. The turning point came during a private tasting for a visiting collector. Luc, in a fit of pique, decided to test her publicly. He poured a glass of deep, mysterious red and demanded an identification. It was a trap. The wine was an enigma, old but vibrant, powerful but elegant. Maya closed her eyes, shutting out the expectant faces, and let the wine speak. She smelled saddle leather, dried cherries, tar, and a faint, haunting aroma of dried roses. She tasted its structure, the fine, resolved tannins, the thread of acidity that was its spine. It was Italian, certainly. Old Nebbiolo. But it had a grace, a perfume that was not quite Barolo, not quite Barbaresco. Gatinario, she said, her voice clear and confident, from a traditional producer, Travaglini. The vintage, difficult. There is warmth, but also a sternness. 1978. The room was silent. The collector, a man who had tasted everything, slowly lowered his glass and began to applaud. Luke stared at her, his usual mask of contempt momentarily replaced by something akin to shock. He snatched the bottle, looked at the label, and slammed it back down on the table. He said nothing, but for the rest of the evening, he didn't look at her. It was the greatest compliment he had ever given her. During this time, Sterling Blackwood's world was contracting. His downfall was not a single, swift execution, but a slow, public garroting by the markets. The story from Ethelgard became a whispered legend, a parable of hubris. His nickname in the trading pits became Lafitte, a cruel joke that followed him everywhere. His lenders, who had once clamored for his business, now saw only the liability of a man with demonstrably bad taste. His empire, leveraged to the breaking point, crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. He sold his penthouse, then his art, then his watch. He was a man watching his own ghost story being written in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. On a crisp October evening in New York, Maya Jimenez stood not in a uniform, but in a perfectly tailored suit of deep emerald silk. She was in Vero, the restaurant she had built with Julian Croft. It was nothing like Ethelgard. The grandeur was not in the chandeliers or the mahogany, but in the details, the hand-thrown ceramic plates, the soft, warm light that made everyone look beautiful, the quiet confidence of a space dedicated to authentic pleasure. She was not a waitress. She was the wine director, a partner, the architect of a vision. She moved through the bustling friends and family opening, her presence a quiet hum of authority. Her conversations were no longer about specials, but about philosophy, explaining to a guest why a biodynamic Chenin Blanc from the Loire Valley had more soul than a famous but factory-made California Chardonnay. She was not just serving wine. She was sharing stories. Late in the evening, she paused by the grand front window, which framed the Tribeca Street scene like a living painting. And then she saw him. He was not just passing by. He was stopped, staring in. It was Sterling Blackwood. The 2 years had savaged him. The expensive overcoat was gone, replaced by a thin, worn jacket. The silver mane was a tangled mess, the face gaunt and shadowed with the grey stubble of defeat. He was staring at the warmth, the light, the clinking glasses, the easy laughter, a man on the outside of a life he once took for granted. His eyes scanned the room, and then, with a jolt, they found hers. Time seemed to bend. Through the thick plate glass, their gazes locked. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by a wave of emotions so raw they were visible even from a distance. Shock, shame, and a profound, bottomless envy. He saw her not as the waitress he had tormented, but as the embodiment of the world he could no longer enter. He was a ghost haunting the edges of her success. She held his gaze, feeling an unexpected calm. The hatred she had once felt was gone, burned away in the crucible of Paris. The pity she might have expected to feel was also absent. He was simply a man, a lesson she had learned, a chapter that was over. She gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not pity. It was acknowledgement. A final, silent statement that their story was concluded, and she was releasing him into the unforgiving night. He flinched as if struck. The simple gesture of closure was, for him, a final judgment. He turned abruptly and shambled away, melting into the shadows of the city that had forgotten his name. A moment later, Julian was at her side. He held 2 glasses, each containing a swirl of luminous ruby liquid. He handed one to her. The aroma that rose from it was sublime, a complex perfume of wild strawberries, forest floor, and spice. Domaine de la Romanée Conti. the truest wine on earth. A ghost at the feast? Julian asked quietly, having seen the exchange. A memory, Maya corrected him gently. She looked from the dark street back to the warm, vibrant room she had helped create. He built towers of glass, but he never built anything real. He just occupied space. And you? She raised her glass, the precious liquid catching the light. We build tables, she said, and the foundation is better. They clinked their glasses. The sound was not the sharp, startling crack of a dropped fork on marble, but a clear, resonant chime. It was the sound of a bell ringing, not to summon a servant, but to announce that the master was home.